Hi there, how are you? Listen, 3 motor function of the nervous system. In the previous lesson 2 of the neurophysiology, we talk about the sensory functions of the nervous system, and the topic of the lesson of the today is the motor function of the nervous system. The nervous system have 2 functions. One sensory function, and second the motor function. When we talk about the motor function unit have common pathway as discussed in the previous lesson. The motor units same the sensory function or the sensory unit, but in some difference. The motor units shown in this figure, the section of motor unit. The motor units have the lower motor unit neurons, ventral horn, ventral root, mixed spinal nerve. This figure showing the cross section of the spinal cord. The spinal cords of the motor function in opposite to the sensory function. The sensory function areas in the spinal cord in the dorsal horn, in opposite to the motor function in the ventral horn, in the opposite sides of the spinal cord in the dorsal sides. The motor units or motor neuron in the ventral sides of the spinal cord. The area of motor units: ventral horn, lower motor neurons, muscle fiber, ventral root, mixed spinal nerve. As in figure, the motor units have the multifunction and multi-description or multi-component. The motor units have every striated muscle has encapsulated muscle fibers scattered throughout the muscle called muscle spindles. The muscle spindles have 2 extraphyseal and intraphyseal fibers, as shown in figure. Alpha motor neuron connected with the ventral roots of the spinal cord. Okay? Alpha motor neuron connected with ventral roots of the spinal cord as shown in figure. In opposites or in difference with the sensory function neuron that connected with the dorsal roots of the spinal cord. The motor neuron connected with the ventral root of the spinal cords. This neuron called alpha motor neuron. Okay? Alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron. The extraphyseal muscle fibers, as shown, and intraphyseal muscle fibers, with all the single fibers, all the extraphyseal muscle fibers, single muscle fiber have intraphyseal muscle fibers, as in show in figure. Okay? The extraphyseal muscle fibers are innervated by alpha motor neuron, as shown. Alpha motor neuron that innervates all the muscle fibers called extraphyseal muscle and called alpha motor neuron. Other type of the neuron, the intraphyseal muscle fibers, are innervated by gamma motor neuron, as shown in figure. Okay? Again, motor units is single motor neuron called alpha motor, and all extraphyseal muscle fibers it innervates, as shown in figure. Motor units are the physiological functional unit is muscle, not the cell. Okay? Motor units are the physiological functional unit in muscle, not the cell. All cells in motor unit contract. Okay, all cells in motor unit contract synchronously, as in figure. Motor units are innervation ratio. This figure shown the motor units and innervation ratio. As shown, the spinal cord and the muscles fiber, the motor neuron in the spinal cords in the connected, as discussed earlier, connected with the ventricle root of the spinal cord. Innervation ratio, fibers per motor neuron, extraocular muscle 3:1, and gastro cinemas 2000:1. This ratio of innervation of the motor neuron units. Muscle fibers innervated by single motor neurons, as discussed earlier. All the extra muscle fibers, or all the motor neuron, called the single motor neuron, innervated all muscle fibers with one, as example, with one muscle fibers innervated by single motor neuron. As shown in this figure, the alpha motor neuron, single motor neuron, that innervates all the extraphyseal muscle fibers. Okay? Motor neuron in the spinal cord muscle fibers innervated by single motor neuron. The muscle cells of motor units are not grouped but are interspersed among cells from other motor units. Okay, the muscle cells of motor units are not grouped but are interspersed among cells from other motor units. Okay, grouped and interspersed among. The coordinate movements needs the activation of several motors. It's called interspersed. Grouped motor units are not grouped but are interspersed. This is the coordinated movement needs the activation of several motors. Because it's not grouped and interspersed among cells. Descending system, upper motor neurons. This is called organization of motor subsystems because it's not grouped. As is not grouped but are interspersed among cells from other units, motor unit organization. This is called organization of motor subsystem. Descending system, this is upper motor neurons. The motor neurons of the upper system have two areas: basal ganglia, getting proper initiation of movement, and connected with motor cortex, planning, initiating, and directing voluntary movement. Cerebellum, a sensory motors coordination. The motor units or motor function have the sensory coordination to orchestrate the movement. In all, cerebellum, sensory motor coordination connected with the brainstem centers, basic movement and posture control. The brain centers basic movement and posture controls connected with two. The first area is local circuit neuron, reflex coordination, not direct coordination, but it calls reflex coordination. The reflex coordination also connected with motor neurons pools, lower motor neurons. The brain centers not connected with only with local circuit neurons directly, but also by local circuit neurons. By local circuit neurons. From the motor neurons pools, as called lower motor neurons, directly to skeletal muscles. As shown in this figure, the cross-section of spinal cord, the ventral roots of the spinal cords, as discussed earlier, the alpha motor neurons, input from upper motor neurons in the brain, directly to the ventricle roots, in coordinate with sensory input from muscle spindle and input from spinal interneurons, because it's not group. This called in this figure, this called coordination. Overview: organization of motor system. In the upper motor cortex, upper region of the motor units, the motor cortex connected directly with the brainstem stem, and from brain stem directly connected to spinal cord. The spinal cord connected directly to the alpha motor neurons. Also directly from the brain stem to the alpha motor neurons, and motor cortex to the alpha motor neurons. In all, from the alpha, the neuron, directly connected from the alpha motor neuron to the skeletal muscles. Okay? Direct or indirect from the motor cortex, the neuron connected to the alpha motor neuron. This is called final common pathway. The final common pathway is the alpha motor neuron that connected to skeletal muscles, because it's not a group. Motor cortex, alpha motor neuron, brain stem, alpha motor, and the spinal cord, alpha motor neuron. Final common pathway of the alpha motor neuron. In this figure is an example of the neuron, or in other hands it's called alpha motor neuron. Example of alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neurons is transmit the neuron its transmitter from the motor nerve fiber. The transmitter, it's acetylcholine esterase. Okay, acetylcholine. The transmitter, it's acetylcholine. And acetylcholine connected with the receptors. When excess amount of acetylcholine, the acetylcholine esterase can degrade the excess amount of acetylcholine. From the axon hillock, the impulse can transmit through the motor nerve fiber and arrive to the ends of the axon. The transmitter can release to the gap junction between the neuron and muscle fibers. Acetylcholine in this time released and connected with the receptors in the muscle fibers. The excess amount of acetylcholine can degraded by acetylcholine esterase. This is example of alpha motor neuron. Final common pathway of the alpha motor neuron. A motor pathway consists of the motor neurons by which nerve impulses from many central sources pass to a muscle in the periphery. Okay, as in figure. Topic 2 of the motor function or motor neuron, the motor function of the spinal cord, called the spinal reflex. This topic called subtopic of the motor function is the spinal reflex. The spinal reflex, somatic reflexes mediated by the spinal cord are called the spinal reflexes. These reflexes may occur without the involvement of higher brain centers. Additionally, the brain can facilitate or inhibit them. Okay? One, stretch reflex. Stretch reflex. Stretch reflex. In this figure, an example of anatomy of muscle spindle in the topic of stretch reflex or spinal reflexes. One, anatomy of muscle spindles as introduction of this topic of stretch reflexes. Anatomy of muscle spindle. In muscle spindles, in this figure, extraphyseal fibers and intraphyseal fibers also show the alpha motor neurons that connected with extraphyseal muscle fibers and motor neuron that connected with intraphyseal muscle fibers, not grouped but interspaced. Spindle different spindle efferent that connected with intraphyseal fibers, not grouped. Again, not grouped but interspaced. Anatomy of muscle spindle. The anatomy of muscle spindles. The muscle spindles detect change in the length of the muscle. Okay, the muscle spindles detect change in the length of the muscle. The change in the length of the muscle have stretch or called stretchers, have stretch receptors that report the stretching of the muscle to the spine. Okay, each spindle consists of 3 and 10 interphyseal muscle fibers enclosed in connective tissue capsule, as shown in figure. As shown in this figure, connective tissue capsule for all interphyseal muscle fibers. These fibers are less than 1/4 of the size of extraphyseal muscle fibers. Effector fibers, called effector fibers. Anatomy, also the anatomy of muscle spindles. The central region of the interphyseal fibers, which lack myofilaments, are non-contractile. This is not contractile, lack myofilaments. Okay, serving as the receptive surface of the spindle, called sensory receptors. This is lack of the interphyseal fibers, which lack the myofilaments, are non-contractile, serving as receptor surface of the spindle sensory receptors. Interphyseal fibers are warped by 2 types of efferent ending, as shown, that send sensory input to the CNS. Okay, one, primary sensory endings type La fibers or LA, called La fibers. And these La fibers innervate the center of the spine of a spindle, as shown. Innervate the center of the spindle. Secondary sensory endings. Okay, intraphyseal fibers are warped by 2 types of efferent ending that send sensory input to the CNS. A primary one The primary sensory endings type La fibers innervate the center of the spindle, and secondary sensory endings type 2 fibers or number 2 fibers associate with the ends of the spindle, okay, interphyseal muscle, warped by 2 type of efferent endings. 1 primary sensory endings type 1 La fibers type 1 innervated the center of the spindle, was secondary sensory endings type 2 fibers associated with the or type A or type 1 fibers that innervate the center of spinal, and the secondary sensory ending type 2 fibers associated with the ends of the spindle, as shown in this figure. This figure as an example of the component of muscle spindle. In this figure, shown the dynamic interphyseal fibers, all or 1 type A or La, or type A or type 1 of sensory receptors or sensory ending, efferent axon. Static in this figure also show the static interphyseal fibers, static intraphyseal fibers, that have a primary endings, were also secondary endings. As mentioned, this show can viewing the primary sensory and secondary sensory ending, primary ending and secondary ending. The contractile region of the intraphyseal muscle fibers are limited to their ends, okay, as only these areas contain actin and myosin filaments, as shown in this figure. These regions of endings are innervated by gamma efferent fibers. Gamma efferent fibers. Okay? Gamma efferent fibers. Muscle stretch reflex from this figure first definition of the muscle figure. First definition of the muscle stretch reflex. Whenever a muscle is stretched, excitation of the spindle causes reflexive contraction of the same muscle from which the signal originated, and also of closely synergistic muscle. Okay, and also of closely allied synergistic muscle. This definition of the muscle stretch reflex. In detail, the basic circuit with definition of the muscle stretch reflex, the basic circuit: spindle to the proreceptors nerve fibers and to the dorsal root in sequence, to the dorsal root of the spinal cord and to the synapses with anterior motor neurons to the alpha motor NF neuron, the same of M from type M from the when the M spindle fibers originated. Circuits of the strength reflexes as in figure: muscle spindle, dorsal root, muscle fibers, tendon, ventral root. Okay, the reflexes of the stretch reflexes of the muscle to the dorsal root, and the motor function from the ventral root. The line pink line is the motor function or motor neuron to the ventral root, alpha motor neuron, and the black line is the neuron of the strength from the neuron of the reflex muscle stretch dorsal to the dorsal root, as in sequence: spindle, proprioceptor nerve fiber, dorsal root of the spinal cord, synapse with anterior motor neurons to the alpha motor NF, the same MF from the when the MF spindle fibers originate. Exciting the muscle spindle occur in two ways. Exciting muscle spindle occur in two ways. One, applying a force that links the entire muscle, activating the gamma motor neuron that stimulate the distal ends of the interfacial fibers to contact, thus stretching the mid portion of the spindle, called internal stretch. Whatever the stimulus, when the spindle are activated, their associated sensory neurons transmit impulses at higher frequency to the spinal cord, as shown in figure. This figure can show action potential frequency increase during stretch, and B, action potential frequency declines during contraction. The type A in figure, muscle during stretch, shown the muscle during stretch and muscle during contraction. This figure showing the monosynaptic reflexes or in all muscle stretch reflex. Monosynaptic reflex has single synapse between the efferent and efferent neurons. From the stimulus to the receptor to the dorsal root. From the receptors when cause stretching muscle to the dorsal root only directly, and the motor neurons, stimulus, receptor, sensory neurons cause skeletal muscle and somatic motor neurons to the ventral root. Okay, because of motor neurons directly contact or enter directly to the ventral root, and the sensory neurons directly to the dorsal root. And response from the efferent neurons, target cell effector, and response This is monosynaptic reflex. And polysynaptic reflex have two or more synapses. Stimulus to the receptor, sensory neurons, to the dorsal root, synapse 1. And when interneuron connect to the motor neuron function in contact with the sensory and motor neuron function, this synapse is called synapses 2. Also, from the ventral root to the efferent neuron, target effector, and response. In detail, monosynaptic reflex at spinal cord, sensory neuron synapses directly monosynaptically with the alpha motor neurons, as in figure, which rapidly excite the extraphyseal muscle fibers of the stretched muscle. The reflexive muscle contraction that follow an example of serial processing assist further stretching of the muscle, as in figure. Afferent impulses from stretch receptor to the spinal cord. Also, in the first initial stimulus muscle stretch from the muscle spindles. Afferent impulse from the stretch receptor to spinal cord to the dorsal root of the spinal. From the ventral root to the muscle spindle, have the efferent impulses cause contraction of the stretch muscle that assist reverse the stretch, and efferent impulses inhibit contraction of antagonist muscle reciprocal inhibition, called reciprocal inhibition. And interneuron, in this figure P, interneuron cell body of sensory neurons in the dorsal root stimulate by the impulse from the muscle spindles from the extensors to the motor neuron serving antagonist muscle groups and to the dorsal roots and the dorsal root of the spinal cord, and from the ventral root of the spinal cord, motor neuron serving quadriceps and other motor neuron serving antagonist muscle group. The reflexive muscle, in detail, the reflexive muscle contraction that follow an example of serial processing is the further stretching of the muscle as shown in this figure. In this figure, branch of the efferent fibers also synapse with interneurons that inhibit motor neurons controlling the antagonistic muscles. Stimulus tap to tendon stretch muscle. The receptor is the muscle spindle stretching and fires directly to the dorsal root of the spinal cord. This pathway is the efferent path. Action potential travels through sensory neurons, interrogating center to the interrogating sensory neuron synapse in the spinal cord in coordinate with the pathway of the motor neuron as somatic can affect the quadriceps muscles. Quadriceps muscle. The response, quadriceps contract, swinging lower leg forward. The hamstring muscles, the effector 2, the effector 1 quadriceps muscles can respond and swinging lower leg forward. The effector 2 from the efferent pathway to interneuron inhibiting somatic motor neurons can cause effector 2, a hamstring muscle. Response, hamstring muscle stay relaxed, allowing extension of leg reciprocal inhibition, called reciprocal inhibition. The reciprocal innervation, as in reciprocal inhibition in detail, reciprocal inhibition of the antagonist muscle is called reciprocal inhibition. Okay, and reciprocal inhibition can caused by reciprocal innervation, as in shown in this figure. The dorsal root ganglion, sensory neurons from the spinal muscle spindle, extensor muscles. This sensory neuron and the motor neuron, when inhibition of the antagonist muscle called the reciprocal inhibition, called the motor neuron inhibited. The motor neuron is inhibited by sensory neurons from the dorsal root to the directly to the ventral roots. Once motor neuron can effector or the inhibited and motor neuron inhibited. In essence, the stretch stimulus causes the antagonists to relax so that they cannot resist to the shortening of the stretched muscle caused by the main reflex. The type of the stretch reflex. Number one, or type 1, tendon reflex, dynamic stretch reflex, called dynamic tendon reflex, called as shown in this figure, called dynamic stretch reflex, caused by rapid stretch of the muscle as knee jack reflex, transmitted from the type 1 or LA sensory ending of the MS muscle spindle, causes instantaneous strong reflexive contraction of the same muscle. Cause instantaneous strong reflexive contraction of the same muscle. Okay. Opposing sudden change in length of the muscle. Monosynaptic pathway. From the monosynaptic pathway, this caused tendon reflex, dynamic stretch reflex from a monosynaptic pathway being over within 0.7 milliseconds. The tendon reflex being over with 0.7 milliseconds. Type 2 muscle tonus, called static stretch reflex, caused by a weaker and continuous stretch of the muscle, transmitted from the type 1 and type 2 sensory ending of the muscle spindle, multiple synaptic pathway continuous for the prolonged period. Non-synchronizing contraction, MC for at least many seconds or minutes, maintaining the posture of the body. the stretch reflex. The stretch reflex is most important in large extensor muscles which sustain upright posture. Very important. The stretch reflex sustain upright posture. Contraction of the posterior muscles of the spine are almost continuously regulated by stretch reflexes. Thank you for listening.